It began, the staff said, with a look. No word, no raised voice, just a pause held a second too long, and everyone who worked for Queen Elizabeth II learned that the pause meant your name had just been added to a list she never wrote down, and never spoke aloud. If these stories from behind the palace doors are worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and more like this one are already queued. The bell means you will not miss them. No one ever saw that list. There was no notebook, no locked drawer, no card index in a private office. And yet, in the household she ran for 70 years, its existence was simply understood. People spoke of it the way you speak of the weather. It was there. It affected you. You could not point to it. Everyone on it knew they were there, and the woman who kept it made sure she never once had to confirm it out loud. Think of the one person you never confront but never quite forgive. You see them at a family dinner. You are perfectly polite. Something has simply cooled, and both of you know it, and neither of you will say it. Now imagine you are a monarch, and you have 70 years. That is the scale of the thing we are talking about. So how did the look actually work? The people closest to her described it in almost identical terms. You would say something or fail to do something, or a story would reach her that should never have reached her, and there would be a beat, a brief stillness. The glance held a fraction longer than a glance should be held. Then she would move on smoothly to the next person, the next subject, as if nothing at all had happened. And in one sense, nothing had. She had not scolded you. She had not corrected you. She had simply registered you, the way a clerk stamps a docket and filed it somewhere no one else could reach. The punishment was never announced. That is the part that unsettled people who worked for her. There was no summons, no dressing down, no cold letter. If you had crossed a line she never named out loud, you often did not learn it in a room. You learned it slowly, over weeks, in the small things that stopped happening. To understand why a silence like that carried such weight, you have to understand who was doing the staying silent. Elizabeth became queen in 1952. She was aged 25. Her father, King George VI, had been unwell for a long time, but his death still came as a shock, and it reached her while she was abroad in Kenya, thousands of miles from home. She had been raised for the role from childhood. She had also been told, in effect, that it would come later, much later, when she was a grown woman with grown children and years to prepare. Instead, it landed on a woman barely out of her 20s, with 2 small children and a husband still finding his own place in the machine. And from the very start, she governed herself with a discipline that unnerved even the most seasoned courtiers. These were men who had served her father, and his father before him. They had watched kings lose their tempers and favourites rise and fall on a royal mood. They expected to manage her. What they found instead was a young woman who almost never gave them anything to manage. She rarely complained. Aides who worked with her for decades struggled afterwards to recall a single moment of open anger. She almost never raised her voice. When something wounded her, when a piece of disloyalty landed, she did not flare. She went still. She absorbed the insult in complete silence, the way a heavy curtain absorbs a sound, and then she simply adjusted how she treated the person afterward. No speech, no scene, just a quiet recalibration that the offender was left to notice on their own. That control frightened people more than shouting ever could. A monarch who shouts is a monarch you can read. You know where you stand the moment the storm breaks, and you know it will pass. A monarch who says nothing, who smiles, who is unfailingly courteous while something behind the eyes has quietly closed, gives you nothing to hold. You are left guessing. You replay every conversation. You wonder what she knows. So let us be concrete about what the withdrawal actually looked like, because this is where the ledger stopped being an idea and became a thing that happened to real people. It began with warmth. There is a particular warmth that surrounds anyone in daily contact with a monarch, a shared joke in a corridor, a private word before a public event. The little intimacies of proximity, the sense that you are trusted, that you are inside. That warmth was the first thing to go. Then the invitations. The weekend at one of the private estates that used to be assumed. The small dinner. The place in the room that put you near her. These did not vanish with a bang. They simply stopped arriving. You noticed, one season, that you had not been asked. Then you noticed it again, and the small daily intimacies that had once marked you as trusted quietly ended one by one until the distance was total and no one had ever named it. Former household staff have described exactly how this played out with one particular aide. This was a man trusted with the most private of things. He was in the rooms where conversations happened that were never meant to leave those rooms. Private remarks, family matters, the kind of detail that only a handful of people in the world were ever permitted to hear. He had earned that access, and access like that was the whole of a courtier's value. And then, staff recalled, the details began to appear in the newspapers. Not the official line, the private stuff, things said behind closed doors turning up in print days later, phrased in a way that only someone who had been in the room could have phrased them. Front pages carrying palace headlines that were a little too accurate, a little too intimate, sourced to no one and understood by everyone inside. There was no confrontation. This is the detail that everyone who tells the story returns to. She did not call him in. She did not accuse him. There was no investigation with him standing in front of a desk while someone read the offending cuttings aloud. Nothing so crude, and nothing that would ever leave a mark on the record. Instead, his access began to narrow. The meetings he had always attended went ahead without him. The papers he had always seen no longer crossed his desk. The role that had defined him was, over a stretch of months, quietly hollowed out from the inside, until the title remained, but the substance had drained away. He was still there. He was also, somehow, no longer there, and eventually he understood that he had to go. No one pushed him. No one had to. A courtier whose access has gone is a courtier without a job, whatever the door still says. So he left. And here is the line that the people who worked alongside him always land on, because it captures the whole method in 6 words. He was never told why. He knew why. Ask yourself which of those is worse, being told you have fallen from favour, being handed a reason, a charge, something you can argue with or apologise for, or at least understand, or being left to work it out alone in silence, watching your own standing dissolve week by week while everyone around you is perfectly pleasant, and no one will say the thing that all of you can plainly see. The first is a punishment. The second is a kind of haunting, because a confrontation, whatever else it is, offers an ending. You can defend yourself. You can be forgiven. You can at least know the size of the thing. Her method offered none of that. It offered only the slow, private certainty that you had been weighed and found wanting, and that the verdict, once reached, was not open to appeal. You did not get to plead your case, because officially there was no case. There was only the warmth that used to be there, and now was not. And this was not a single incident. This was the shape of the thing across the entire reign. The same pattern repeated in different rooms, with different faces, across 70 years. Someone crossed the line she never named. The pause came. The warmth withdrew, and the offender, sooner or later, understood, without ever once being told precisely why the ground beneath them had turned to sand. The Queen never had to say it. That was the genius of it, if genius is the right word for something so cold. She never had to make an accusation she might one day have to defend. She never had to leave a letter that could be leaked in turn, or utter a sentence a disloyal aide could carry to a newspaper. She let the silence do the work, and silence, unlike a spoken word, can never be quoted against you. It cannot be proved. It can only be felt, and felt most sharply, by the one person it is aimed at. Think about how much self-control that takes. Most of us wounded want the other person to know we are wounded. We want the row. We want them to see the damage they have done. She wanted the opposite. She wanted them to see nothing at all, to face a surface as smooth and untroubled as the one the whole world saw when she waved from the balcony, serene, gloved, composed, giving away not a flicker of what she had filed away that morning about the person now bowing in front of her. That is the image the public knew, the steady hand, the calm at the centre of every storm, the woman who never seemed to take anything personally, because she never seemed to react to anything at all. And the staff who watched her up close were describing the same woman, only from the other side of the glass, where the calm was not the absence of feeling. It was feeling, controlled, recorded, and held in reserve. So the list was never a piece of paper. It was a habit of mind, a way of moving through decades of insult and disloyalty and small private betrayals without ever once losing the surface, while underneath, quietly, an account was kept. Names went on. Names stayed on. And the people whose names went on carried that knowledge around with them for the rest of their careers, sometimes the rest of their lives, never confirmed, never denied, never spoken. Now that aide who leaked to the papers, the man whose desk quietly emptied, he mattered. But in the scale of this ledger, he was a small name. He embarrassed a household. He passed a few private remarks to a few hungry editors, unpleasant, disloyal, the sort of thing that ends a career inside the palace walls. But it stayed, more or less, inside the family of the court. There were far larger names than his. There were people who did not merely embarrass a courtier or leak a private conversation, but who wounded the family itself, openly, in front of the entire world, on a stage the palace could not control. And friends of the Queen suggest that each of them, in their turn, went on to the same ledger, recorded with the same silence, remembered with the same patience. It starts with a single televised interview, broadcast in 1995, watched by millions, that took the most private grief of the House of Windsor and put it on screen for everyone to see. It aired on the 20th of November, 1995, a dim room, a single chair, and Diana, Princess of Wales, looking straight into the lens, while a journalist named Martin Bashir sat just off camera. The Panorama interview with Diana in 1995 ran for roughly an hour, and by the time it finished, the private grief of a royal marriage had been carried into more than 20 million homes in Britain alone. You have to understand what that meant inside the palace. For 4 decades, the Queen had governed by silence. She had absorbed insult, disloyalty, embarrassment, and let none of it show on her face. And now, in a single evening, the most intimate wound of her son's marriage was being discussed by strangers over dinner, dissected on the front page, replayed the world over. The one thing she had spent her whole reign protecting, the dignity of the family and public, was gone in an hour of television. If you remember watching that interview live, you were watching the exact moment a line was crossed, not the line of the divorce itself, the line of the spectacle, the turning of the family into entertainment. The Queen said nothing. Of course she said nothing. That was never how she worked. But those close to the household noticed the temperature change in the weeks that followed. Within a month, a letter went out from Buckingham Palace in her own hand to both Charles and Diana. It urged them plainly to divorce. Friends of the family read that letter as more than administration. It was the Queen doing what she always did when a line was crossed. She was drawing an account to a close, and here is where the ledger, that list she never wrote down and never spoke aloud, widens out. Because the leaking aid from before was a small entry, a private betrayal, handled privately. What Panorama represented was something larger, a whole category of offence, not the person who embarrassed a courtier, but the person who exposed the crown itself to ridicule in front of the entire world. That category was the one she guarded most fiercely. Break with the family in private, and there might be a path back. Break ranks in public, hand the monarchy over to the cameras as a soap opera, and friends suggest the name went onto the ledger in ink that never faded. Think about who fell into that category over the years. It was a long list, and the Queen watched every name arrive. There were the tabloid campaigns, the ones that ran for months, feeding on leaks, chasing the family through the 1990s like hounds after a scent. Every grainy long lens photograph, every recorded phone call splashed across the papers, every so-called royal insider quoted anonymously. The Queen read the newspapers every morning. Staff have described how she went through them at breakfast, calm, methodical, saying almost nothing. But she read them. She saw which editors ran which stories. She noticed who profited from the family's worst weeks. None of it was ever mentioned aloud. All of it, friends say, was filed. And then there were the memoirs. This one cut deeper, because these were not strangers. These were people who had stood inside the palace, who had been trusted with the small daily intimacies of royal life, and who then sold what they had seen. Over the decades, a steady stream of former household staff put their memories on the market. Cooks, protection officers, private secretaries, a governess long before them, a butler after. Each book promised the reader a peek behind the curtain. Each one turned service into a product. To a woman who believed that discretion was the entire point of the household, that the whole dignity of the institution rested on the people around her keeping their silence, nothing was quite so unforgivable as a servant who talked for money. Consider what loyalty meant to her, and you understand the depth of the injury. Elizabeth had been raised to see the household not as employees, but as an extended, permanent family, bound by a promise that ran both ways. She gave them decades of security, quiet kindness, a place in her life. In return, she expected one thing above all others: silence. Not silence out of fear, silence out of belief in the thing they all served together. So when a former member of staff broke that silence and printed the private moments for profit, it was not just a breach of contract, it was a betrayal of the promise itself, and betrayal, once recorded on that ledger, was never quite refunded. That phrase matters, because loyalty really was the single currency that mattered most to her, more than talent, more than cleverness, more than charm. You could be brilliant at your job and cold at the centre, and she would keep you at a careful distance. You could be modest and unremarkable and utterly loyal, and she would hold you close for life. She weighed people on that one scale, and once your loyalty had been spent, once you had traded it away for a headline or a book advance, there was no earning it back at par. The account did not reopen. The warmth simply stopped. And that was the punishment. Never a public rebuke, never a furious letter, just the quiet withdrawal of warmth. The invitation to the private lunch that no longer came. The Christmas at Sandringham that was suddenly, wordlessly, no longer extended. The small human recognitions that had once made a courtier feel chosen, gone. and never explained. The offender was left to work out for himself what he had lost and why. He always did. It is a chilling portrait if you stop there, a monarch keeping a silent tally of everyone who ever let her down, punishing them in ways so quiet they could never even be complained about. Cold, almost merciless. But here is the part that changes the whole picture. The same list that punished also kept receipts of kindness. Because the ledger was never only a record of betrayal, it cut both ways. For every name marked by disappointment, there were others, many others, marked by something closer to love, the same discipline, the same long memory, the same refusal to say things aloud, worked in reverse for the people who stayed loyal. She remembered them just as precisely. She simply expressed it differently. Take the dressers, the women who spent decades laying out her clothes each morning, who knew the exact shade of every hat, who travelled the world at her side and saw her without the crown, tired, ordinary, human. One of them, Angela Kelly, came from a working-class background in Liverpool and rose to become one of the most trusted people in the Queen's life, not through birth, not through rank. Through years of quiet, faithful service, the Queen gave her a level of closeness that many titled aristocrats never reached. That was the ledger too. Loyalty, remembered and repaid. Take the pages and the footmen who served through reign after reign, decade after decade, who knew how she liked her tea and never once repeated a word of what they overheard. Take the ladies-in-waiting, some of whom stood beside her for 50 years and more, from the early days of the reign to the very end. These were not staff in any ordinary sense. They were companions, confidants, the small circle of people who had chosen her and kept choosing her year after year without ever asking for anything in return. And she did not forget them. This is the detail that turns the whole story human. The same woman who could freeze a man out with a single held glance would, for the people who had earned her trust, write private notes in her own hand, small, warm, personal messages that no one else ever saw. Not official correspondence, kindness, put on paper, for one reader only. And it went further than notes. When she died, and her affairs were settled, there were remembrances in her will for the people who had served her longest and most faithfully. Not grand public bequests, quiet ones. A sum here, a personal object there, a token that said, without saying it, I noticed, I remembered, you mattered to me. The dresser, the page, the long-serving lady-in-waiting, each was accounted for. The final act of the ledger, on the side of devotion, was written into the last legal document of her life. Before we follow that thought all the way to the end, one small thing, quickly. If these stories from behind the palace doors have been worth your time so far, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more, like this one already queued and ready. The bell notification is the part that matters. It means the next story reaches you instead of getting lost. Then we go straight on. Because once you see both sides of the ledger together, the whole picture reorganizes itself. It stops being cold. It becomes something far more complicated and far more human. The same silence that punished also rewarded. Sit with that for a second. The pause that meant a name had been added in disappointment was the very same pause, the same held look, the same wordless certainty, that meant a name had been marked in gratitude. She used the identical instrument for both. She never raised her voice to condemn, and she never made a speech to praise. She simply adjusted the warmth, up or down, and let the person feel it. That is the paradox at the heart of everything staff and biographers have described. Her silence was not emptiness. It was never the blankness of a woman with nothing to say. It was judgment, held in reserve, a lifetime of observation kept inside, weighed carefully, and expressed only in the temperature of how she treated you the next time you were in the room. Think of what that took, 70 years of meeting thousands upon thousands of people, prime ministers, dictators, film stars, distant cousins, the man who leaked to the press, the woman who sold her memoir, the dresser from Liverpool, the lady-in-waiting who never left her side. Every one of them measured on the same private scale. Everyone filed, and almost none of them ever told to their face exactly where they stood. That is a discipline that borders on the superhuman. Most people, wounded, want the other person to know they are wounded. Most people, grateful, want to say so out loud. Elizabeth did neither. She converted all of it, the hurt and the love alike, into the same steady, unreadable calm, and she carried it, every slight, every kindness, all of it, inside, and the people around her knew. That is the strangest part. No one ever saw a list. There was no notebook, no file, no written record anyone could point to. Yet everyone in that world understood that it existed, because they could feel it working. They could feel the warmth arrive or feel it withdraw. The courtier who had crossed a line knew. The dresser who had earned her trust knew. The ledger was invisible and completely real at the same time, and its accuracy was legendary among the people who lived inside its reach, which brings us to the question that no biographer has ever fully answered. It is the question that sits underneath this entire story, the one that has been waiting since the very first glance held a second too long. If she carried it all for 70 years, every betrayal and every act of devotion weighed in private and never spoken aloud, then what happened to the full ledger at the very end? A record that lived only in one mind, a tally kept by a single person in complete silence across the longest reign in British history. What did she do with it in the last hours at Balmoral in September of 2022? Did she settle any of it? Did she forgive the names marked in disappointment, or did she take them with her exactly as they were, unrefunded to the last? And the people who had earned the other side of the ledger, the loyal ones, did they ever truly know the depth of what she felt for them? Or did that go with her too? Everything about the way she lived suggests she gave nothing away, even then, that the ledger stayed sealed inside her, precise and complete, right up to the final breath, which leaves the one question that matters most of all. If she really did hold every slight and every kindness inside her for 70 years, weighing them privately until the end, then the true meaning of the list is not in any single name on it. It is in what she chose to do with the whole thing at the very last, and in what that final choice reveals about the difference between the crown that demanded she forgive and forget, and the woman who quietly, faithfully, remembered everything in September of 2022. The answer is almost disappointingly simple. Nothing happened to it. There was no reckoning, no final settling of scores, no deathbed reconciliation for the cameras. When she died in 2022 at Balmoral, in the early autumn of a reign no one alive could remember beginning, she took the whole thing with her, every slight, every kindness, 70 years of quiet arithmetic, closed for good. Think about what that means for a moment. A woman who had met more world leaders than any person in history, who had sat with prime ministers from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, who had seen empires shrink and families fracture and secrets spill into the tabloids year after year. And she carried the ledger of all of it inside her, unwritten, unspoken, and then she simply left. No one ever opened it. No one ever read it. There was nothing to read. That is the part that unsettles the people who study her, because a document can be found, a diary can be published, a letter, however carefully hidden, can turn up in an attic 60 years later, the way Queen Victoria's did. But this was never on paper. Former household staff who spent decades within a few feet of her have said again and again that they never once saw a list. And they are telling the truth. The list was in her head, and her head was the one place no biographer, no journalist, no rival courtier ever managed to enter. So here is where the whole story turns. For 17 minutes, you have been hearing about a woman who punished with silence and rewarded with silence, who let a leaking aid fade out of the room without a single accusation, who cooled toward those who wounded the family and warmed toward those who served it. And you might have been waiting for the moment where the mask slips. The furious letter, the private outburst, the score finally settled out loud. It never comes. And that absence is not a gap in the story. That absence is the story. Because her silence, when you look at it properly, was never emptiness. It was judgment held in reserve. This is the thing that separates her from almost every other powerful figure in modern history. Most people in power need you to know they are angry. They need the confrontation, the memo, the raised voice, the public dismissal, because the anger only feels real to them once it has been witnessed. Elizabeth needed none of it. She could hold a verdict inside her indefinitely, complete, precise, and entirely private, and act on it 100 small ways without ever announcing that a verdict had been reached. That is not coldness. That is discipline of a kind almost no one possesses. She was, in the plainest terms, the most disciplined keeper of accounts in modern royal history. Not a queen who forgot, not a queen who forgave and moved on. A queen who remembered everything, weighed everything, and told no one what the scales had decided. And now hold that beside the image you actually grew up with, the woman on the balcony, the pastel coat, the matching hat, the gloved hand turning at the wrist in that famous unhurried wave, the corgis, the horses, the handbag that launched 1,000 jokes, the serene, almost grandmotherly figure who seemed from the outside to float above the mess of ordinary human grievance, untouched by it, too gracious to hold a grudge. That woman and the keeper of the ledger were the same person, standing in the same body, at the same moment. The serenity the world adored, and the private accounting almost no one saw, were not two different Elizabeths. They were one. And the calm face was not hiding the absence of judgment. It was hiding the presence of it. This is the thing the official version never told you. The calm was the ledger, the composure that biographers praised and the public trusted, the famous even temper, the refusal to be drawn, the sphinx-like neutrality across 70 years of provocation. That was not the opposite of the woman keeping score. That was the woman keeping score. The stillness was where the judgment lived. And once you see that, the whole architecture of her reign clicks into a different shape. Because here is the gap this entire story has been circling. The gap between the crown and the woman who wore it. And they were not the same thing. They were, in some ways, opposites forced to share a life. The crown, the institution, the firm, whatever you want to call it, demanded one thing above all others: continuity. The show goes on. The family closes ranks. The scandal is absorbed. The offender is quietly managed. The machine keeps moving toward the next reign. Institutionally, the monarchy cannot afford to hold grudges, because a grudge is a crack, and a crack, repeated across generations, brings the whole thing down. The crown had to forgive, not out of virtue, but out of survival. The disloyal courtier gets a pension and a discreet exit. The wayward relative gets folded back into the Christmas photograph. The institution forgets on purpose, because forgetting is how it endures. The woman did not forget. That is the whole thing. That is the sentence the entire reign was built on top of. The crown demanded forgiveness and continuity. The woman remembered. She sat inside an institution engineered to let things go, and she personally let nothing go. And she could not resolve that contradiction because there was no resolving it. So she did the only thing a person of that discipline could do. She performed the forgiveness the crown required in public, flawlessly, for 7 decades. And she kept the memory the woman insisted on in private, permanently, where the institution could not reach it, which is finally why everyone on that list knew they were on it, without a single word ever being spoken. You have wondered about that since the beginning. How does a man know he has been marked when nothing has been said? How does an aide understand he has to go when no one tells him why? How does a friend feel the temperature drop when the smile is still perfectly in place? Here is the answer. They knew because of the gap. They had been trained, their whole careers, to read the institution's warmth as the real thing. The invitations, the small intimacies, the private notes, the ease. And when the woman underneath quietly withdrew that warmth, while the institution's polished surface stayed exactly the same, the difference was unmistakable to anyone standing close. The crown was still smiling at them. The woman had stopped, and in that space between the two, in that gap, the verdict was as loud as a slammed door. That is why no confrontation was ever needed. The confrontation would have been the institution's tool. Elizabeth used the woman's tool instead, which was the simple, devastating removal of herself from the relationship, while every official courtesy remained perfectly intact. You still got the handshake. You just never again got the person behind it. Loyalty to her was the only currency that ever truly counted, and betrayal, once it was recorded, was never refunded. Not with an apology, not with time, not with the institution's convenient amnesia. The account simply stayed closed, and she never had to confirm any of it. That is the last piece, and it is the cleverest. She never confirmed the list existed. She never denied it either. She never confronted a soul, never explained a withdrawal, never gave a single person the satisfaction or the injury of hearing the verdict said aloud. And that was not an oversight. That was the entire mechanism. Because the moment you say it, you give it away. A spoken accusation can be argued with, denied, apologized for, forgiven, leaked to a newspaper and turned into a story where you are the villain. But a silence cannot be argued with. You cannot appeal a verdict that was never announced. You cannot defend yourself against a charge that was never filed. The not saying was not weakness or avoidance. The not saying was the power. It left the marked person alone with their own knowledge of what they had done, with no way to fight it and no way to undo it, which is a far heavier sentence than any word she could have chosen. Before I take you back to where all this started, one thing. If you have made it this far, you now understand the pause differently than you did 10 minutes ago. So it is worth saying plainly, because this is the kind of story this channel exists to tell, the ones that live in the gap between the palace's official version and what the people closest to it actually saw. If that is worth your time, subscribing costs nothing, and there are more of these already waiting. The bell is the only way you will know when the next one lands. Now, go back to the very beginning, back to the thing that staff said started all of it, not a word, not a raised voice, just a look, a brief pause. A glance held a second too long, and then she moved on. When you first heard that, It probably sounded like very little, a trick of nerves maybe, a courtier reading too much into an ordinary human moment, the way anxious people do around the powerful. A pause is just a pause. You know better now. That pause was the ledger opening. In that one held second, a name was being weighed, filed, and moved to the other column, and the person on the receiving end was watching it happen in real time, without a single thing being said. The glance held a second too long was not hesitation. It was the verdict being entered. Everything that followed, the narrowing access, the vanishing invitation, the warmth that quietly went cold, all of it was already decided in that pause. The staff who learned to fear that look were not superstitious. They had simply learned to read the one visible edge of a document no one else could see. And she did that by the most careful reckoning of the people who worked beside her for 70 years. Thousands of people passed through her orbit. Prime ministers, presidents, cousins, servants, friends, enemies, dressed as friends. Every one of them was being read. Every one of them was, in some quiet way, being scored. And she carried the sum of all of it, the whole enormous private balance sheet of a century, entirely alone, telling no one, until the drawer closed for the last time in Scotland in the autumn of 2022. There is an image the mourning crowds outside Buckingham Palace never saw that September, standing in their miles-long queue, laying their flowers against the railings. Somewhere behind those walls, a desk, private papers, a drawer that would be sorted and sealed and archived by people who loved her. And in none of it, on none of those pages, was the list. Because the list was never a thing you could put in a drawer. It went where she went. It was, in the end, the most personal thing she owned, and the one thing she made absolutely certain she would never leave behind for anyone to read. So we are left with the paradox, whole and unresolved, exactly as she left it. The serene figure the world saw waving from the balcony was also the most disciplined keeper of accounts modern royalty has ever produced. Her silence was not a lack of feeling. It was feeling held under total control, converted into judgment, and kept in reserve. The gap between the crown and the woman who wore it was not a flaw in her. It was the space she lived in, deliberately, every single day, forgiving in public because the institution required it, and remembering in private because she was a person, and persons remember. And this is what the list finally tells us, the thing no biographer will ever prove because the evidence walked into the ground with her, that the most powerful act available to the most powerful woman of her age was not a decree, not a dismissal, not a single word of anger. It was the decision to say nothing, and to let the not saying do everything. She ruled a great deal of her private world through pure withheld speech, and she was better at it than anyone before or since. The crowds are gone now. The flowers are cleared. The balcony wave that 100 million people can picture from memory dissolves, if you let it, into a quieter image, a woman in her final years, composed, watchful, still reading the room the way she always had, still weighing, still filing, still saying nothing, and beside her, in a place none of us will ever open, a drawer, closed. No one ever saw the list. Everyone on it knew they were there. She never confirmed it, and she never denied it, and she took the full weight of it with her, unread, complete, and hers alone. And that, perhaps, was exactly how she wanted it.